Well, hello. Welcome back to our study of 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, a church that he had founded on his second missionary trip, Corinth being in Greece, on the isthmus between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese, the great peninsula that attaches to the mainland. He had founded this church. He'd stayed there for quite a while. Left it then, and while he was in Ephesus, he wrote this letter that we refer to as 1 Corinthians. It's very much a pastoral letter. Paul is the founding pastor of this church at Corinth, and this church at Corinth has problems, many problems. And so they've written Paul about these problems and asked for his advice. So Paul tells them what he thinks. But first of all, before he tells them what he thinks about the problems that they wrote about, he talks to them about problems that they didn't relate to him, but which he found out about. One was the divisiveness that was in the church at Corinth, the cliques that were there. So in the first part of the letter, he speaks extensively about the fact that there shouldn't be cliques in a church. People saying, I follow Apollos, I follow Paul, and so on. No, he says Christ is not divided. We should all be just for Christ, and we should have unity in that respect. Then a second problem that he talked about, that they didn't tell him about, but he found out about, was some very gross sexual immorality. A man was having an ongoing sexual relationship with his father's wife, probably his stepmother. And he said, you people in Corinth, you should be shocked by this, but you're not. Deal with this. Sexual immorality in a church is a devastating thing, and so get rid of it. And now, after dealing with these problems that they didn't tell him about, he begins to talk about the problems or questions that they did raise with him. And that's what we see in chapter 7. Today we're in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. And he says, now for the matters you wrote about. So now he's getting down to those questions that they wrote him about. And those questions, the first question, seems to be a lot about marriage. Is marriage a good thing? What about singleness? Should people remain single? Should they get married? We're going to look at this chapter, and Paul discusses it. But the bottom line is this. Paul says, it's good to get married, and it's good to be single. Either way is okay. But the important thing, no matter what state you're in, is first of all to make sure that you are serving the Lord wholeheartedly. Let's look. He says in verse 1, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So it's good not to marry. It's good to be single. But because of the immorality that is there within the church, a man should marry if he wants to, or a woman if she wants to. The husband, verse 3, should fulfill his marital duty to his wife. This is talking about sexual intimacy, sexual intercourse. And likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. In other words, when you get married, you're making a commitment. It's not just a commitment to live together, but a commitment to share your bodies with each other in a sexual way. Verse 5, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So if the two of you decide for spiritual reasons you want to not have sexual intimacy for a while so that you can pray more, I guess there were people who were raising that possibility with him. He said, that's okay, but make sure that it's only for a short period of time. Because Satan, if you go on too long, Satan might use that time to really tempt one of the partners. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am. Paul says here that he actually is single. He's not married at the moment. But each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. So in order to remain celibate, he's saying, that's a gift from God. That's an ability that not all people have. So if you have that gift of celibacy, that you can refrain from sexual temptation and live alone in a single state, good. But not all have that gift, he says. Verse 8, now to the unmarried and widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. See, there he is. He's talking about the fact that he's not married. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So, if you're single, if you're unmarried, stay that way if you can. But if you can't control your sexual impulses, then it's better to marry. He's not saying run out and get married, marry the first person you see. But he's saying don't try to stay in this unmarried state if you're not really prepared and equipped and gifted by God to do so. Verse 10, to the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. So he's speaking then with the authority of God, of Jesus. Jesus is saying this, not Paul. A wife must not separate from her husband. He's talking to two Christians who are married. Two Christians, a man and a woman married, should not separate. But if she does, she must be reconciled. She must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. If you're two Christians in marriage, you shouldn't think about divorce. If you do separate, then you should remain unmarried. And really what you should be looking forward to and trying for is reconciliation. Now what if you're married to an unbeliever? What, for instance, should happen if here you are, you and your spouse are unbelievers, but you become a believer? So now you're a believer and your spouse is not a believer. What should happen in that situation? Well, Paul gives his advice. He says this, to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. So Paul is saying, I am giving this advice. Jesus doesn't have a statement that I can draw on and then tell you what it is concerning this situation, but I am going to tell you, and you better listen up because I'm the apostle. Remember he said that earlier on? I'm going to tell you what I think about this. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a man has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. Okay? You weren't either one of you believers. You became a believer. Now your spouse is an unbeliever. What should you do? Divorce your unbeliever? No. if your unbelieving spouse is willing to live with you and keep the marriage intact, then good. Here's the reason. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Oh, what Paul is saying is not that because you've become a believer, that you're now saved, that your husband is saved also. No. What he's saying is, because your unbelieving spouse is with you in marriage and you're a believer, you now are a conduit. You're a way in which your spouse is going to hear and know about God in a way that they wouldn't if you were to separate. So you are able to bless your spouse then if you remain in that marriage and he remains there as well. Verse 15. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. So if the unbelieving spouse says, oh, I can't live with you any longer. You're a believer, a Christian, and the way you're living is different than the way you're living before. I just can't take it anymore. If he leaves, if he initiates the leaving, he leaves, then let him. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. You're not bound. You're now free. Free even to marry again. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? There's that possibility if you stay in the marriage, the partner stays in the marriage, the unbelieving spouse. But if he does, she does leave, then let them. You're not bound because we're called to live in peace. And now he talks about peace and the fact that when he just gave an instance of when you become a believer, don't think that you have to change your marriage from the fact that you are married to an unbeliever. Now he talks about other circumstances where you shouldn't think about changing when you become a believer, that you should live in peace. He says, each one of you, verse 17, should remain the place that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. So, before we were believers, we were in a certain situation. And Paul says, stay in that situation, okay, if you can. Now he's going to speak to them. This is the rule I laid down in all churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Well, circumcision was an important matter to those people who were from a Jewish background, certainly not those from the Gentile background. But Paul is saying, don't change from being circumcised to uncircumcised. I don't know how you do that. Or uncircumcised to circumcised. He's just making the point. Circumcision really doesn't affect your Christian experience. So don't worry about it. This is what does, last part of verse 19. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Circumcision doesn't count. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Verse 20. Each one should remain in the situation which he was in when God called him. Whereas, this is interesting, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he was a free man when he was called is the Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation God called him to. So, when God called you to be his, if you were in the position of being a slave, don't think that that necessarily means that you should now seek freedom, that should be your new state. It's okay to remain as a slave. But if you have the opportunity to become free, don't pass it down. Pass it by. And then he makes the point that you're really not a slave to any person if you are literally a slave, because in Christ you're free. We're all free in Christ. But paradoxically, while we're free in Christ, he now goes on to say, but we're all slaves or servants of Christ. So we have this dual thing that is happening. We're free in Christ, but we're also servants or slaves of Christ in the sense that we are setting aside ourselves to do his will, which is what's important. Keeping God's commands is what counts, he says. Verse 25, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So once again, he's speaking not by a commandment that he knows of, but on his own authority as an apostle to be listened to. Because of the present crisis, not sure what that is. There may have been persecution happening in this place at this time, but nobody's really positive about this. I think it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Paul says to be married is okay. To be unmarried is okay. But he says, if you are married, there will be troubles that will come to you as a result of your being married. And these relate to the fact that you always have to think about this other person that you may be responsible for, your spouse. He gets into that more in the next little while. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. What does that mean, the time is short? Is he talking about the second coming of Christ? Is he talking about the persecution that's happening here and so there isn't much time? Is he talking about the fact that life is short? From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in it. For this world in its present form is passing away. Basically, what he's saying here is don't become too attached to worldly things. The Christian life is a life lived in the world, but we are in the world and we're not of the world. And so to become attached and to have so many concerns and anxieties about worldly things isn't the path that a believer should trod. Verse 32, I would like you to be free from concern. Now he's going to talk about the fact that married people have concerns. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affair, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So the way to live is to be wholeheartedly for the Lord. And he's saying there's an advantage if you're single. Because if you're single, you don't have to worry about anybody else. You can just worry about yourself being wholeheartedly committed to God, body and spirit. But if you're a married man, you have to think about your wife. And he doesn't mention children here, but you have to think about your children too. And if you're a married woman, it's the same thing. You have to think about your husband. And so you have, in a sense, he says, an undivided loyalty. So there is an advantage. There is this advantage to being single, to not having a spouse. You don't have to worry about anybody else. You can just give yourself wholeheartedly to the Lord. Verse 36, if anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if she, getting along in years and he feels he ought to marry, he should do so as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does even better. Verse 39, important truth. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In other words, marriage is for life. Two Christians, they're married. That's for life. They should understand that that's for life. But if the husband dies, then she's free. And if his wife dies, then he is free. And what that means is free to marry. Free to marry. But he must belong to the Lord. In other words, you marry somebody, you're free to marry, but you must marry another believer. Believers are to marry believers. Sometimes you're a non-believer, you're married to a non-believer. You become a believer, now you're in a mixed marriage. You're a believer, he or she isn't a believer. Okay. You weren't a believer when you started. But if you're a believer, then you're to marry a believer. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. In other words, if a widow is happier if she stays as a widow. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Paul thinks that, again, he just thinks that the single state is the better state to be in if you are a believer, because he said both states are good, married and unmarried, but there is an advantage to being unmarried as a believer. Well, what are our takeaways? Well, in a sense, we've already mentioned a few of them, but let's look at what they might be. The first one is this. Both singleness and marriage are worthy states for a Christian to live in. It is a good thing to be a Christian and to be married. Good. It is a good thing to be a Christian and to be single. Good. Whether you're married or single as a Christian? Good, good. 2, there are advantages and disadvantages of each. Well, the obvious advantage of being married is that all of us have that sexual component of our lives whereby we look on somebody of the opposite sex. We're attracted to them. And so we have this draw towards sexual intimacy. And we want to have this person that we can have sexual intimacy with. And that happens when you're married, because you then have another person who you can have sexual intimacy with. And God would bless this. But the disadvantage is that you can't be wholeheartedly for the Lord. Well, you can be wholeheartedly, but you can't do everything you might want to do because you always have to think about your spouse. Then the disadvantage of being an unbeliever, a single person, is that you don't have this person that you can have sexual intimacy with because you're single. But the advantage is you don't have to worry about anyone else. You can just be wholehearted. Make every decision you make, you don't have to think about your married partner. 3, when you commit yourself to marriage, you are committing yourself to sexual intimacy. Withholding it from your spouse is wrong. That's a commitment. Maybe it's one we don't think about as often as we should when we are in the process of exchanging our vows in terms of being married, to get married. But we're committing ourselves. I'm yours. I'm yours. Soul, spirit, and body too. And you have a right to my body. You have a right to sexual intimacy with me because we are committing ourselves to each other in marriage. So you're making that commitment of yourself, of your body, to be involved with sexual intimacy when you're married. 4, where divorce is permitted. Where is divorce permitted? Well, it doesn't talk about it here in this chapter, but we know the Lord said adultery. If a partner goes out and has sexual relationships with somebody outside the marriage, that would be grounds. You don't have to get divorced, but that would be grounds for divorce. So that would be one. And the other is the desertion by the unbelieving spouse. The unbelieving spouse says, look, you became a Christian. I don't like living with you anymore. I'm leaving. Both cases, the person is free then to remarry. 5, externals have no bearing on a person standing before God. Remember he talked about 1, circumcision. It doesn't matter if you're circumcised or uncircumcised. When you're called, that doesn't affect whether you can be a believer or not and be for the Lord. Same thing he says about a slave. Whether you're a slave, in those days, I mean, in the days of the Roman Empire, there would be many who would be in that state of being a slave. He said, that's not going to affect your Christian life. Or if you're free, that's not going to affect it. And think about other externals. There could be a lot of other externals. You live here, or you live there, you have this job, or you have that job. You don't have to change your externals, unless they're sinful, when you become a believer. 6, the primary concern for all of us should be our devotion to the Lord. Our marital status affects our ability in this. So this is the main concern that we should have. Bottom line, whether you're married, whether you're not married, whether you're a slave, whether you're free, whether you're circumcised, whether you're not circumcised, whether you're in this place or that place, what should matter to all of us, is our devotion to the Lord. This, bottom line, is the most important thing. Hope that you are content in whichever state you are in. Some watching are married. Hope your marriage is a happy one. If you're single, I hope your singleness is a happy one. You don't need to change. You can stay where you are. But be wholehearted for God. God be with you. We'll see you next time.